Welcome back to TIFF's Industry Conference, or welcome if this is your first panel. I'm Tom Powers, the festival's documentary programmer. I'm coming to you from my home in New Jersey, the traditional territory of the Lenape. Before we get started, I want to thank our lead sponsor, Bell, our major sponsors, RBC, L'Oreal Paris, and Visa, and our major industry supporters, Telefilm Canada and Ontario Creates. This panel is presented by Showtime Documentary Films. Our topic is Steps to Creating a Better Documentary Industry. This is a conversation that's building upon many others that took place this summer. I want to remind you that you can type questions into the bottom left. Those questions will be pulled up for me to see. Other people can't see them, but I can, and I'll probably save most of the questions until the end, but if there's things that seem pertinent as we go along, I'll try to get to as many as I can. On my Twitter page, I pasted links to some of those prior discussions that I mentioned that inspired me this summer. They include 2 articles by our guest, Sonya Childress, that were published on Medium. And another inspiration for me is the TIFF documentary Inconvenient Indian. It's directed by Michelle Latimer, inspired by the book by Thomas King, and produced by our second guest, Jesse Wente. This summer brought a new wave of attention and awareness to questions about representation in documentary, but I want to be clear that there's nothing new about the struggles for filmmakers to tell stories about their own communities inside a white-dominated industry. I think of the Black American filmmaker William Greaves, who moved to Canada in the 1950s to study documentary making at the NFB and then brought those skills back to New York. And I think of Alanis Obomsawin, who started making films for the NFB in the early 1970s. And just 2 days ago, when this industry conference had a panel on narrative sovereignty, you could hear Alanis being repeatedly invoked by a younger generation. So when questions come up, why aren't film crews more inclusive? Or why are the gatekeepers so white and homogenous inside foundations and distributors and festivals? No one should say these are new questions. I just gave examples from Black and Indigenous communities, but the same can be said for many other backgrounds. This year, the film Crip Camp highlighted people with disabilities. And this year at TIFF, we have the film No Ordinary Man that reflects on the erasure of transgender lives. We could name many other communities who are looking to make documentaries with more authenticity and accountability. So my hope in today's conversation is not to spend too much time recycling points that should already be clear, but to explore where we're going to go from here. And now let me bring on my 2 guests, Sonya Childress and Jesse Wente. Jesse, welcome. Sonya, welcome. Jesse's joining us from Toronto. He's at the reception of for Inconvenient Indian, finding a quiet spot to talk to us. Sonya is joining us from her home in Los Angeles against the backdrop of the fires that are happening now in California. Sonya, let me start with you. Just for people who aren't familiar with your background, can you summarize all the things that you've done in documentary and say something about your new fellowship at the Perspective Fund?
Sure. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Well, thanks, Tom, for inviting me to have this conversation with you and Jesse. It's an honor. It's exciting. And also wanted to give my acknowledgement that I'm on stolen and occupied Tongva land here in Los Angeles. So I've been working around documentary for about 20 years now, and I began probably at, the first spark came as an undergraduate student at University of California at Berkeley, where I was taking classes. I was on the campus when Marlon Riggs was teaching at the J School there. And I took classes from, veteran filmmakers and film critics like B. Ruby Rich and Lonnie Ding. So that's those are the teachers that really opened my eyes to this medium. And then I got into some youth organizing work, and then came into film through Active Voice, which was Ellen Schneider's initial organization after she left POV as executive producer. And so my first foray into this work was through Impact. And I have been essentially working in the field of impact and engagement for about 20 years. 6 of those at Active Voice and with other organizations, and then about 14 of those years at Firelight Media, which is the production company based in Harlem, led by Stanley Nelson and Marcia Smith. So, you know, I'm not a filmmaker myself, although I've produced. I am essentially see myself really squarely in the impact camp. But because I've worked for so many years with filmmakers and really deeply with the protagonists and have been part of many funding panels, I've been lucky to have a kind of a bird's eye view of the field.
Great, and I mentioned you have this new fellowship with the Perspective Fund, which my understanding is kind of giving you some space to think and write about these questions. Can you say more about what that is?
Sure. So the Perspective Fund is a fairly new funder in the nonfiction space. They fund both impact campaigns and production, and now they are doing some field building resourcing. And so I have started a 2-year fellowship. I started just this January, right after Sundance. And I am going to be looking at a few different, it's giving me some space to kind of step back, download 20 years of some of my learnings and what I've seen in the field around impact in particular, thinking about how we can deepen the field of impact producers, think about interventions we can make to make the work and the practice of impact production a sustainable one, and also think about how we codify and deepen the knowledge production around this practice of impact producing. So I'll be doing that as part of my fellowship, writing and some new interventions. And then I'll also be thinking and doing some work around deepening the ecosystem of BIPOC media makers here in the States, and connecting collectives that are springing up across the country so that the work is aligned and amplified. And then I'm also really thinking a lot about how we elevate a conversation and advance a conversation around the ethics and values that drive not only our filmmaking practices, but the industry as well.
All right. Jesse, let me turn to you. You and I were colleagues at TIFF for 11 years. You have a varied career as a journalist, as a festival programmer, now in a new position as chair of the board at the Canada Council for the Arts. Can you summarize your background particularly in the places where you've overlapped with film, documentary, and the questions, kind of storytelling questions that we're talking about today?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me on the panel. It's a great honor to be here with Sonya. I am a great admirer of her work. Summarize, I don't know, I'm into movies, and so I spent a long time around movies, most of my professional career, either as a critic or a programmer. And I guess now I've produced my first feature, which is at the festival this year, which is a documentary, Inconvenient Indian. And I think perhaps more importantly to this discussion is I am the executive director of something called the Indigenous Screen Office, which is a office here in Canada dedicated to Indigenous storytellers, increasing their representation and opportunity for them within the Canadian screen sector, as well as advocating for narrative sovereignty for Indigenous storytellers within that sector. And I mean, documentary fits into that, so I would say that's the highlights.
And can you describe the history of that office for outsiders who aren't familiar with it?
Sure. The Indigenous Screen Office was announced by the Heritage Ministry here in Canada in the fall of 2017. And it came after many years of advocacy by Indigenous storytellers here in what is now called Canada, or is what is currently called Canada. And for 20 plus years, it's modeled after the Indigenous Screen Office, which has existed in Australia for 25 years. So I would say the advocacy started for it here roughly the day after it was announced in Australia. And it finally came to be. I took over as the first employee and the first executive director in spring of 2018. So we're very new, but the advocacy from the community for this office has been around for many, many years. We currently now have, I work with a staff of 4. We've just opened up a round of development funding that has 2 separate elements to it. One is for Indigenous creators, and then another is actually a solidarity fund that we've done with Black and BIPOC organizations here in Canada. Since we have a little bit more administrative heft, even though we're only 4 people, we are incorporated. So from a legal standpoint, we are able to disperse funds in a way that those organizations aren't able to. So we've taken on that administrative load for them. And we actually just announced some $500,000 in partnership funding as part of our COVID relief funding for Indigenous storytellers here in Canada in the screen sector. So that gives you some idea. And maybe most germane, Tom, to this discussion is one of the first things we did was, along with the Imaginative Film and Media Festival, also located here in Toronto, we developed something called the Pathways and Protocols document, which is a document that is meant to guide really anyone that's interested in engaging with Indigenous communities and engaging with Indigenous storytelling. And while it was created specifically for the screen sector, it's actually a right relations document. So it could actually be applied, the principles of it could be applied to virtually any industry that is attempting to interact with Indigenous peoples, both certainly specifically, I guess, here, but it's quite open. The document's available on our website because it's also meant to be interpreted by communities so that they can adopt it for their own specific protocols, since of course it's a multinational place. So that gives you an idea of where we're coming from when it comes to telling stories, who gets the opportunity to do that, and how we imagine achieving something like narrative sovereignty.
And so just for people who heard that and want to go find that, what should they Google to find that document?
Indigenous Screen Office, or you can just go to our website, iso-bea.ca, and it's under the resources tab. Great.
So, we talk about this summer as a time of reckoning. Sonya wrote an article called A Reckoning. Sonya, let me start with you. What does this time mean for you? And where do you think it can lead?
Not to rehash kind of what I said and what so many others have said, but this is, this reckoning is brought, is not just, falling on our laps here in the nonfiction field. We're undergoing a global reckoning, and certainly in the Western, within Western countries who are having to confront, centuries of, the opposite of right relationship with communities whose land they took, whose labor they took. We're in the United States, just, for example, this reckoning that we're seeing in nonfiction, we're seeing in the theater world, we're seeing in journalism, we are seeing in the way people are in law schools, in the way law is applied in the criminal justice system, certainly the way journalism is taught. And, it's a reckoning about a correction, a demanding for a correction of longstanding norms that favored one group over another. And I think, the pandemic certainly brought brought us to a standstill, you know, as a people, and forced us to confront what came after the initial pandemic, which was this uprising because of police brutality and state violence, and then the confluence of that, with a recession. Has forced, at least in the United States, but certainly you could say North and South America, a confrontation with our past, a confrontation with how our past has shaped our future in ways that we don't always like to acknowledge. And I think the dire in economic circumstances, the real fears around people's physical safety has just turned what was once somewhat polite conversation, and that was maybe assuaged by superficial responses. It just took all of that off the table and said, we need to look at the core issues that have created inequity and pain, and we have to confront them, and we have to think about new pathways, not a restoration to what we had pre-COVID, but we have to create something new systems, new economic systems, new relationships, new centers of power, new norms and understandings of why and how we do this work. It all needs to be rethought. It all needs to shift. And so, what it looks like in our field, we know what it looks like. It looks like angry Facebook messages. It looks like confrontations at film festivals. It looks like people out of work and festivals and organizations closing down. I mean, it's a cascade. But what we're talking about is that the foundation on which this field and this country was built on is broken, and we can't dance around that anymore. We have to look at that. And so that's, to me, what this reckoning moment is really about.
Jesse, I want to get your thoughts on this. I mean, this summer we did see, corporations making statements about Black Lives Matters. We saw, at least one sports team retire an old racist name. We saw some things that are merely performative, and some things that feel like they're going deeper. So I wonder how you see if you see a power in this movement to leverage further change.
I mean, there's definitely a power in the movement to leverage further change. I mean, you mentioned the mascot issue. First Nations people have been protesting outside that stadium since the 60s, every opening game. But it changed this year. And why is that? I'd suggest a couple of things that collide. One is, most importantly, in a solidarity between racialized people, between Indigenous and Black people. We have a lot of solidarity and mutual interest in this moment. Things like mascots and the dehumanization that they represent are interconnected with the dehumanization that is enforced by police and that we see in their actions and in so-called justice systems. And so, I think it's not a coincidence that it took a solidarity movement to actually see that change. It also comes because we saw, they're changing syrup and rice and all this sort of stuff. And, I think one thing to keep in mind, those are all brands. And we have to understand that racism is part of branding and was part of branding, and that its interconnectedness with capitalism, and in fact, capitalism's reliance on racism, means that in this small slice, briefly, racism became unprofitable. And while I would love to imagine that Dan Snyder, the owner of that football team, has somehow had a moment of revelation, I think we have to be brutally honest. He has not. His dollar was threatened, and so he made a change. I think this is instructive in terms of how to protest a strategy around, in a capitalist system, attack the money. That is a very effective way to do it. But one thing, Tom, I think so much of what we're discussing is that these are harm reduction measures. These, you know, even the ISO, if we were to achieve everything we wanted to, that would still ultimately just be harm reduction. Because unless we have a fundamental shift in the underpinnings of what our society guides, and that is capitalism, unless we're actually going to get to those things, shifts in documentary, and they're great and they're much needed, but ultimately they are harm reduction for our community who are wishing to operate in those spaces under a capitalist system. If we really wanted to change it for our great-grandchildren, we have to end capitalism. And where storytelling can help is that we actually need to start telling a story, because capitalism has used storytelling to a remarkable effect to condition and make people believe that it is a system that serves them when it never was and was never built with that intention. It is a system to serve a very few and grind the rest of us under its heel. And if there's a way for us to start counteracting the storytelling that prizes individualism over collectivism, that prizes individual achievement over collective achievement, then we should be engaging in that storytelling immediately. The world, not to put it too bluntly, literally hangs in the balance of these choices that we're making. Unfortunately, you know, we were talking to Sonya before we came on. I mean, the world is literally burning where she is. It is figuratively burning pretty much everywhere else. And yeah, I mean, I absolutely, when I read Sonya's piece this summer, it moved me, and we need all of these changes, but we can never lose sight that they are just a small piece of a much bigger thing. We need to shift all of the equity in all of these sectors that we can achieve will ultimately be meaningless if the solution is just presented as more capitalism. That is just not a solution for this, and we need to get there. And unfortunately, we need to get there at a speed that I worry our society is right now just unable to grapple with.
Jesse talks about capitalism. Sonya, in your articles, you talk a lot about the economic power structure that the documentary film industry is a part of. I want to bring this to, you know, to the point of view of a documentary filmmaker who's trying to navigate in this world, telling their stories. And on the one hand, to reach a wide audience potentially means having to engage with corporate infrastructures that, you know, may not have as their top goal telling an authentic story. Or you can tell your own, you know, pure story, and there are outlets that you could take it to, whether it's the Imaginative Festival or the Black Star Festival in Philadelphia, or that kind of grassroots network. And there's a lot in between. Sonya, you talked about the way in which you're working to help connect this rising tide of grassroots networks. There's organizations like Brown Girls Doc Mafia and ADocs and Forward Docs and Cousin, and so many of these really important organizations that have appeared in recent years. For the people who are in those organizations, who are, you know, deeply committed to telling authentic stories about their community, but also want to make a living within this capitalist system, want to, you know, reach the widest possible audience, want to, you know, grow their careers as much as possible. Can you talk about some of the, you know, the tensions that are faced there, and, you know, what you see as the kind of creative solutions that people are finding to work their way through that?
I love what Jesse said, because I think, you know, we have to name the specter of capitalism that shapes everything that, that shapes the framework in which we're all working in, and also just say that capitalism is racialized, right? And within a racialized capitalist system, filmmakers of color are and white filmmakers are navigating this field in many ways, commodifying stories and considering how stories become commodities in which they use as leverage to position themselves in an industry that feels unsustainable, personally unsustainable. And the problem isn't about who gets to tell whose stories. It's that we are competing in a capitalist and racialized capitalist system, and we are being told that in order to survive that, in order to win that competition, we've got to jockey, we've got to trade in stories, we've got to churn work out faster, which means we are not in right relationship with the people who we're telling stories about. We are just commodifying that stories, churning it out and handing in the next one. We are trying to think about the market value of stories, and how we leverage the market value of stories. It has poisoned and influenced all of these artistic choices at a very basic level, beyond just how people try to navigate a career in this field. It is influencing our artistic choices. This racialized capitalist system is influencing our curation, and an artist's basic artistic choices. So I think we have to kind of say that. Because I think in some ways, and I would also just push back that these festivals like Black Star or Imaginative, that's creating a festival, these spaces are centers, and have been, especially for the more established festivals, are centers of gravity. They may not be considered elite spaces. They may not be considered gatekeeping sites of power to navigate yourself within an industry. But for the filmmakers and for the audiences, this is the place of power. And I think we have to also recalibrate our thinking around that, around the importance of these spaces. These are the audiences we've been wanting to serve. These are the communities we're in relationship with. These are the places where artists are being truly nurtured and audiences are being truly cultivated. So I want to just, put the emphasis back on these places that have been doing incredibly good work for a very long time, and are not kind of side places to kind of, churn your wheels while you get called up by the big dogs. I would also just say, I think, because we are talking about a larger system that affects the field, I think this is a moment in which filmmakers have to engage in justice movements that address those issues head on. I don't think we are filmmakers and artists in our culture have the luxury of just making art. I think we have to be in relationship with movements, because we are not going to fix the structures in our field without being part of a movement that is trying to do that. And we can make, we can put Band-Aids, and we can do harm reduction kind of work, as Jesse's saying, we can try to fix representation at certain levels. We can try to address pipeline issues. We can make little fixes and inroads here and there. But ultimately, if the system is intact, we are just tinkering with the machinery. And what artists are of all backgrounds need to think about is, if our films are about inequity, but we are not invested in how to change that inequity, we're simply looking at it and looking at it and looking at it and interpreting it and representing it. It is unconscionable for us to not be engaging in justice movements that end that inequity. At a fundamental level, we have to be in conversation. And the people who are pushing justice around, anti-capitalism or abolition movements are putting harder asks in front of all of us as a society. And that's what we need to be a part of. We need to be in conversation with these movements, I think, if we really want to see some change.
Let me, when I hear what you're saying, I hear a sense of bringing activism to documentary filmmaking. I think there are many different models of documentary filmmaking. There are some films where people are collaborating with the people who are on camera and who they're making films about. There's other forms of filmmaking that are trying to keep a journalistic distance from their subject because they're diving into something they don't want to be too close to someone that they're making a film about, because they want to see that person or see that subject for its flaws as well, and to be critical about a subject. I wonder, for either of you who want to take this on, thinking about this, these different kinds of filmmaking, particularly the what I'm talking about is what I'm describing as journalistic distance.
I think what a privilege that is. I mean, I guess some of that I would say, I mean, journalism is somewhat apart to me than documentary. Some documentaries act as journalism, some do not. I think there's a reckoning happening around the false narrative of objectivity in journalism, because it doesn't exist, or if it does, it's for a very privileged part of the ruling class to get to have that. In filmmaking, I guess, to me, the key is not so much whether you want to have an authorial distance from your subject. It's what's your accountability to your subjects and their community. What is your transparency in terms of your process back to them? Are you in right relations? If you want to be at a distance because that's the style of film, or that's how you want your audience to understand that story, fine. But I think there still has to be an accountability and a transparency and a right relations with both your subject and your audience. And it strikes me, Tom, that one of the challenges documentary has, and I think this is true of cinema in general, is as a medium, it was born with these problems right away. Like, when I think of the first images shot by Thomas Edison, those sort of, those were false images. Nanook of the North, often credited as the first documentary, completely made up film. And so, I think this is one of the things for when people that don't come from those traditions, when we actually gain access, is to transform those spaces into something like when those falsities and those issues are built into the medium itself, it can be a challenge for filmmakers that come from that tradition to actually unpack that. And I think that's why we need more artists engaged in this, so that they can actually figure out how to do these things. Because I'm not sure I have the answer, or a programmer is going to, but an artist may have a different approach. And just to quickly go back to your discussion around the business, and I think so much of that stuff is bullshit. I think we're told that the audience likes these things, but we live in a world where we don't have total free choice. So Marvel movies are really popular, but they're also one of the few things that gets made on that scale and pushed in that way. So is that the audience loves them, or is that we're sort of conditioned to do all of that? And I think that's also why we need leadership change across the industry, because I don't think that's a lot of that stuff is true. And I think we get told those things by people who are gatekeepers and have a specific idea, and who grew up in a place where there weren't diverse stories. So of course they don't think those work now, because they haven't worked in the past, because they weren't ever tried in the past. So that you get in this circle, when I think we have ample evidence all the time that these stories work just great and are totally marketable and win Best Picture at the Oscars, like an anti-capitalist, anti-colonial story from Korea wins Best Picture at the Oscars. Because that distributor gave it the same shot it did they equalized the Oscar push, and voila, it won. And so I think if we equalized the effort we put into these films, if we equalize the money, the time, maybe even extended time, because I agree with Sonya, part of the issue is the churn that the machine of the industry has decided is the right thing for it, when that isn't an artistic practice, that's an industrial practice. And so we need new leadership to break it up. One of the things we're looking at when we offer development is elongate what that means. What in Canada, 6 months and $15,000. Well, that's not that good. What if it was $50,000 and a year, or, you know, like, make these things better, invest the same amount that we have, and stop clinging to notions of what the market wanted 20 years ago. I think we're perilously close to where we were in the 60s and 70s, where the people that actually run the sector no longer have any connection to the audience they're trying to sell. And back then what they did was just turn over the reins to the filmmakers. And they should do the same thing now, but in a way more equitable thing. The revolution of our moment, even in the COVID moment, is not a technological or even business-based revolution. It's who is telling the story. That's what is the big change we need to see. And that ultimately will actually change a whole bunch of the rest of the ecosystem. Once you empower different storytellers and give them the same runway that we have for everyone else, they'll change, just like those folks changed the sector to what we have now. It can be changed again just by empowering people in the same way that we've empowered other communities, or the dominant cultures empowered itself over and over again. Give us that opportunity, and you know, we can change it. I don't know how to decolonize a set, but I bet if I fund a bunch of Indigenous filmmakers for the next 20 years at a level that they've never received before, I bet they'll figure it out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sonya, when we talk about kind of near-term making progress in this capitalist documentary system that we live in, that, you know, this few weeks ago, maybe it was a panel that you moderated at Black Star, I heard someone say they talk about this as the golden age of documentary, but it's become the corporate age of documentary. You know, we know that a lot of the people who are making the choices at the bigger companies are white and homogenous. Do you see, in your conversations, since you've been kind of close to this, do you see things changing there?
Changing where?
Changing at, you know, some of the larger companies. I mean, you know, companies. Do you see more, you know, hires happening that are going to make these organizations more inclusive?
You know, not yet. I think, you know, actually, I think a lot of these, this isn't a really an incredible moment when we see the dominance of these commercial platforms, these streaming platforms, these commercial players, and influence the field in ways that, you know, have fundamentally changed how the industry operates. And I think I talked about, we went from documentary being spinach of the media ecosystem to like the sexy neighbor across the street, and it's very, very different. And I think the flush of money from these commercial platforms has really changed things, and it's I think what's bewildering about all of it is that at least in the United States, so many filmmakers, in particular emerging filmmakers of all backgrounds, get their first foray into this work through public media dollars. And public media has a mandate to public good. It has a mandate to reach diverse audiences. And that in many ways shapes the kind of ethos that some filmmakers have as they enter this field. When you're thinking about people who are entering into nonfiction, maybe from Hollywood, from scripted television, from feature films, and now they're seeing these commercial platforms that are giving out resources to or are open to pitching to filmmakers who've never done nonfiction and saying, why don't you try your hand at a true crime series? These folks are not coming into the field with the same ethos necessarily. They are coming into the field maybe with different tropes in their head that worked in fiction. Mm-hmm. They're coming into the field through an entity that has a profit motive at the foundation, that are thinking, they're coming into the field through an entity that is not investing in the careers of artists, is not doing a whole lot to provide transparency around who that artist is reaching in terms of their audience. So there's all this kind of, there's a whole different method of operations on the commercial side than from the public side. And even for people who get private philanthropy for their early films, there's at least some level of transparency and accountability that isn't there on the commercial side. So I think as those platforms begin to dominate the field and bring in filmmakers who are not even in relationship with people who've been in the nonfiction field for a very long time and not particularly that interested, because these commercial platforms are creating in many ways like a studio system where they have some vetted filmmakers who might have been vetted on the fiction side and who they are kind of, there's a funnel where the content can come from them, and they're very comfortable, and they're not comfortable with this whole other pool of candidates. And so I think, because the field is getting these new filmmakers who maybe have a very different orientation to the work, these commercial platforms have a very different orientation to the communities. I think that's why they've been even slow to respond in this moment in an authentic way beyond a solidarity statement on a website. And I think what they are doing is, as Jesse said, they're trying to address optics. The optics of an all-white staff, the optics of an all-white leadership team looks bad in this moment. So they're trying to make some quick leadership changes. But fundamentally, these are commercial platforms that are built on profit motives. And I'm not sure how you fix that. But throwing one person of color into a sea of other folks is not going to fix anything. It's just going to make that person have a really tough hill to climb to create an ingrained system. So, I have not been particularly hopeful about how these commercial platforms are responding in this moment. Not hopeful yet, but I do think that for better or for worse, pressure works. Pressure is what makes change for those commercial platforms.
Jesse, let's turn to the example of Inconvenient Indian film that's playing at TIFF that you produced, directed by Michelle Latimer. Can you talk about the experience of getting that project made? How, are there examples of in the making of that project that tell us something about the conversation we're having now?
I actually don't think so. We were quite blessed, I think, in that it was my first time producing, so I don't actually have anything to compare it to. The financing part was very easy, which I understand is not normal at all. So
wait till your next one, Jesse.
Well, you say that, Tom, but I'm very good. That part was easy. It got trickier, I think, when it started to actually making the picture. And we have a broadcaster. It's a very traditional broadcaster. I think there was some challenges because it was an adaptation, because there was a book. I think anytime you're adapting, there's already an audience expectation or even a funder expectation in terms of what the type of film we made. And we made a film that is not the book, and we were never going to do that, because I think making that book into a film is actually impossible. So we used the book to sort of jump off of. And so there was some uneasiness around that. I think, frankly, Michelle would probably speak better to it. I know that unlike the majority of productions that happen in Canada, this is a production that had an Indigenous person both as the director, but also a different Indigenous person as a producer. Usually in Canada, they're the same person if you can get them at all, because that works under the qualifies for funding here. And I think Michelle would be better to speak to this, but I think that did make a difference in that there's not one individual having to advocate for what was right among a whole bunch. There was two of us, and we were working with partners. When I came on, I made it very clear about what my expectations were going to be about how this film was going to get made and how it was going to work. And those expectations were really, the Indigenous folks are really going to decide what this movie is. And, we're here for notes and absolutely guidance and all of that stuff. But I wanted Michelle to make the movie, and I wanted to support her in that. And I think my producing partners wanted both of us to make the movie and supported us in that. But that is rare, and I think it shouldn't be. And we need, that's why certainly a key part for the ISO is getting more Indigenous producers, because I can't really produce while I'm running the ISO. This project was set up before that started, so that's even why it exists. But we need more, because I want more producers to have that same experience that Michelle had, and not always have to fight. You know, you mentioned, Tom, when we started off, we're not going to talk about stuff that everyone should already understand. When you actually make a movie, you don't get that opportunity. So many racialized people have to start at 101 and explain to a whole cast and crew about how this is going to work. And we need, that's why they need more allies on set, more allies in the broadcasters and the funders and the distributors and the exhibitors through the whole thing, so we don't have to restart conversations every new project. We can have again, we need our own community in this, and we don't always have that around us. It can be very hard, and we need to build that capacity. So I hope Inconvenient Indian sort of stands more as this is the goal sort of idea, and even then it wasn't maybe fully there, but it was a incremental part, and hopefully offers a different way. It also took us almost 4 years to make this film, and it strikes me, with just thinking through this panel, I can't think of where we would have sped that up. It actually just needed that time, and we were blessed enough to give it that time. And I think that's about just changing the mode of how we work. And you know, it took some occasionally, I don't want to say tense, but you know, moments where we had to discuss with the broadcaster, yeah, the movie isn't going to be delivered when we said it's now happening here, and this is why. And a lot of that had to do with, we wanted to make sure we maintain right relations and we're doing it the right way, and that takes care. And yeah, and that is something we don't often see too much around other folks. When they come into our communities, they don't necessarily take the same care, and they don't necessarily have the same relationship. So again, that gets back to why it's important that communities tell their own stories and have the same capacity to do that as everyone else has.
We got about 10 minutes left. I want to, we have some audience questions. So Nadine Patterson is asking about how BIPOC indie filmmakers and organizations in Canada and the USA can support each other in their work. Sonya, you've been working a lot with these grassroots organizations. Can you, expand upon ways in which you've seen people be supportive of each other?
Yeah, I think this, we don't often get the chance to kind of practice solidarity as BIPOC communities, and I think because we're often kind of just trying to get put on ourselves, and sometimes get into a competitive stance, or just happy to get in before the door closes behind us. And I think practicing solidarity across communities of color is really important, and there are lots of ways to do that. One might be supporting festivals that are rooted in ethnic communities or racial communities outside of your own, and privileging those festivals, thinking about bringing your film to those festivals if they're open to them, is one way. Or simply attending as an audience member is really key when that festival is in your community. Thinking about how to, if you are in a position, you get a fellowship, you're part of a lab program, you feel like the representation of other communities is not as strong, using your voice and saying something when you are in that position is important. Ensuring that other voices are at the table besides the voice of your particular community is really important. Social media, we can do a lot to amplify other collectives and work. Brown Girls Doc Mafia, just raised, a couple of more than $200,000. And that's an incredibly diverse group of more than 4,000 women filmmakers. And that kind of work, I think, is really, these are all really great exercises. It's a muscle that we have to exercise, this work of solidarity, and which is beyond the kind of work of allyship, but really taking an active role in elevating and amplifying one another's work, and using whatever leverage we have as artists or as staff at organizations to speak up for groups that are not at the table. I mean, you know, Native erasure is huge. We should all be starting there first. Certainly, you know, there's a lot we can do, I think, as artists of color. And then as groups become, you know, organize themselves into collectives, I think it's really, you know, that kind of power building within an ethnic or racial community or gender community or community of, you know, of identity affiliation is hugely important. We need this kind of internal power building because there's tons of fissures within our communities. We're not of one mind. So that work is really important. And when that group becomes mature and becomes strong, that group needs to start working with other communities. And that's when that solidarity work comes in. And again, all of this is just, these are muscles that we have to continually exercise and flex so that we come into our own power.
Jesse, Sonya talked about social media as one tool for amplifying, and you both are on Twitter. And
too much, Tom, but that's all right. That's all right.
Yeah, so am I. I want to ask you about the role of social media, because it has played a factor in leveling the playing fields, and where people can have a voice and people can join together to have a voice. But it also can be an ugly space. Like on a bad day, Jesse, I would not want to see what your mentions look like when people are turning against you. I wonder if you can, reflect on the, both the good and negative sides of social media in this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess after all these years, I've sort of resigned myself that social media, it's a tool. And so you can sort of, whenever you're given a tool, it's sort of how you use it. And we can watch how other people use it. And I think that's it. I think it can be a tool that can help build community, but it's a virtual community. You still actually have to get in face-to-face for it to really, I think, be effective. It can be good for spreading information, but we've seen it's also exceptionally good, maybe even better at spreading disinformation and misinformation. So, I mean, if I'm completely honest, Tom, I use social media because I feel I have to. I yearn for the day when I will cease thinking I have to and cease all activity, because I ultimately think, and maybe this is just in the pandemic, to me it feels like even more toxic now than it was at the beginning of the year. And when I look down to what's happening south of us, it's deeply troubling, and I worry that we will be have a first, a ringside seat for the collapse of an empire. So social media has played no small part in that. So I guess what my advice or how I would view it is, it's a tool. Use it to what you want to get out of it. Try to ignore how other people are using it. And if you want to use it as an organizing tool, it is fantastic as an organizing tool. Go to reach people, organize them, but it's also not the actual organizing. If you see what I'm saying, it's the organizing ends up in the street. And I would say that as we're talking in Toronto today, there's a meeting that was advertised all over social media, a solidarity march with 1492 Landback Lane, which is a continued story here right close to where TIFF is, just an hour or so away at Six Nations, which is the largest Indigenous First Nations community in all of Canada, where they are occupying their traditional territory and being arrested. Journalists are being arrested for covering the story. That happened just last week in Canada. And we've seen a number of journalists arrested for covering Indigenous protests or occupations living on their land. So you need to, it's great to get all that, but ultimately we need to actually be in the streets. If I wasn't doing this, that, you know, I would have hit the reception and be right out with my cousins marching in the street. So I wouldn't put too much stock in social media other than its utility as a tool and how you use it. And the rest of it, I would try to divest from. And I suspect we will be divesting from, willingly or not, relatively soon. But to me, that's how I view it. It's a tool like we used to organize on the telephone or with sheets of paper or however we used to do it. This is just a tool for us to do that, and it can be effective, but it can also be a very dangerous space. So that's how that's how I'm sitting, as someone who is often scared to open up their DMs.
Sonya, we have 1 minute left, and we've talked about, I think Jesse made a reference to allies, and I wonder what allyship means to you.
You know, in this moment, I think we all carry different privileges, you know, relative to other people. And I think part of this moment calls us to be much more honest and transparent about the privilege, the lens at which we look at this work, the privilege that each of us holds, how we can leverage our privilege to bring others along, and how we can, but ultimately these conversations are not just about representation, they are about power. And sharing power is one step, but the next step is ceding power. And if people have been in power for a disproportionate amount of time, disproportionate to the people who are, you know, within their network, within their community, within the field, it is important to think about how I can either share power, but ultimately cede power. And that's the moment we're in. There are asks to share power, and there are now demands to cede power, because new leadership will bring new ideas. If things are broken, we can't go back to what we just don't want to fix that broken teacup. There may be a different way, and that requires new people at the table. That requires a ceding of power. Whether or not we always feel powerful, we all have to acknowledge we all hold some level of power, and it's important for us to think about whether or not we need to hold that power in perpetuity. So I think this allyship is about acknowledging power, sharing that power at the very minimum, ceding that power as the next step.
Very strong point to end on. People who want to follow these good people on Twitter, Jesse Wente, Sonya Childress, you can, my Twitter feed, Tom Powers, you can follow some of their articles that that I've linked to. Jesse and Sonya, Jesse, thank you for taking time away from being arrested in the streets today to be with us. Sonya, thank you for taking time of breathing toxic air in Los Angeles to be with us. I always learn a lot from both of you, so I really am very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom McWitch.
Hang in there, Jesse. Take care. Thanks, Tom.
You too, Sonya.